Is it all right?
It's all right.
These are recollections of a dozen still photographs I made several years ago. Does it sound all right?
Yes, yes, perfectly. It's fine.
This is the first photograph I ever made with the direct intention of making art. I had bought myself a camera for Christmas in 1958. One day, early in January of 1959, I photographed several drawings by Carl Andre, with whom I shared a cheap apartment on Mulberry Street. One frame of film was left over, and I suggested to Carl that he sit, or rather squat, for a portrait. He insisted that the photograph must incorporate a handsome small picture frame that had been given him a year or so before by a girl named North. How the metronome entered the scheme I don't recall, but it must have been deliberately. The picture frame reappears in a photograph dated March 1963, but there isn't time to show you that one now. I discarded the metronome eventually, after tolerating its syncopation for quite a while. Carl Andre is 12 years older and more active than he was then. I see less of him nowadays than I should like, but then there are other people of whom I see more than I care to. I despised this photograph for several years, but I could never bring myself to destroy a negative so incriminating. I made this photograph on March the 11th, 1959. The face is my own, or rather, it was my own. As you see, I was thoroughly pleased with myself at the time, presumably for having survived to such ripeness and wisdom since it was my 23rd birthday. I focused the camera, sat on a stool in front of it, and made the exposures by squeezing a rubber bulb with my right foot. There are 11 more photographs on the roll of film, all of comparable grandeur. Some of them exhibit my features in more sensitive or imposing moods. One exposure records what now looks to me like a leer. I sent that one to a very pretty and sensible girl on the occasion of the vernal equinox, a holiday I held in some esteem. I think I wrote her some sort of cryptic note on the back of it. I never heard from her again. Anyhow, photography had obviously caught my fancy. This photograph was made in the studio where I worked. It belonged to the wife of a friend. I dare say they are still married, but he has not been my friend for nearly 10 years. We became estranged on account of an obscure mutual embarrassment that involved a third party and 3 dozen eggs. I take some comfort in realizing that my entire physical body has been replaced more than once since it made this portrait of its face. However, I understand that my central nervous system is an exception. This photograph was made in September of 1960. The window is that of a dusty cabinet maker's shop on the west side of West Broadway, somewhere between Spring Street and West Houston. I first photographed it more than a year earlier as part of a series, but rejected it for reasons having to do with its tastefulness and illusion of deep space. Then, in the course of 2 years, I made a half-dozen more negatives. Each time I found some reason to feel dissatisfied. The negative was too flat, or too harsh, or the framing was too tight. Once a horse was reflected in the glass, although I don't recall seeing that horse. Once I found myself reflected with my camera and tripod. Finally, the cabinet maker closed up shop and moved away. I can't even remember exactly where he was anymore. But a year after that, I happened to compare the prints I made from the 6 negatives. I was astonished. In the midst of my concern for the flaws in my method, the window itself had changed from season to season, far more than my photographs had. I had thought my subject changeless, and my own sensibility pliable, but I was wrong about that. So I chose the one photograph that pleased me most after all, and destroyed the rest. That was years ago. Now I'm sorry. I only wish you could have seen them. In 1961, for 6 or 8 months, I lived in a borrowed loft on Bond Street near the Bowery. A young painter who lived on the floor above me wanted to be an old master. He talked a great deal about gums and varnishes. He was on his way to impastos of record thickness. The spring of that year was sunny, and I spent a month photographing junk and rubble, in imitation of action painting. My neighbor saw my new work, and he was not especially pleased. His opinion upset me, and for good reason. He lived with a woman, I believe her father was a Brazilian economist, who seemed to stay with him out of inertia. She was monumentally fair, and succulent, and indifferent. In the warm weather, she went about nearly naked, and I would invent excuses to visit upstairs in order to stare at her. My photographs failing as an excuse, I decided to ingratiate myself in the household by making a realistic work of art. I carved the numerals you see out of modeling clay and then cast them in plaster. The piece is called A Cast of Thousands.